Let's talk about Logic Pro. Now, I spend most days spending most of my day inside of this software, and I often forget about the cool and efficient tools that come with Logic when you buy it. So I'm going to go over a few simple and effective Logic Pro tips to help you make better music. Tip number one would be to use track stacks. Now, a track stack basically lets you take several different tracks in your session and group them all together. And there's several reasons that you'd want to do that, and I'll explain that here in a second. But to create a track stack, we're going to select all the tracks that we want to be in a specific group. We're going to right click and hit Create Track Stack, or hit Command-Shift-D on your keyboard. Now we have the option to pick between two different types of track stacks. There's a folder stack and there's a summing stack. And a folder stack is the basic type of grouping that just allows you to mute, solo, and control or automate the volume of that specific grouping of tracks. Now a summing stack not only groups the tracks together, but also turns the main stack into a bus, allowing you to add different processing and sends to affect all the instruments inside that group as a whole. Now this is the easiest way to do bus processing. You don't have to go into your mixer window and reroute everything. You can just select the tracks that you want to process together and put them in a summing stack. So there's three main ways that I use track stacks, and the first way is just for general organization. And I get overwhelmed looking at a 73 track session here, and there's all these different tracks, and so I bust them down into groups, keeping all the drums together, all 12 tracks in one group, and all the bass tracks all in one group as well, and it just helps me not lose my mind. The second way I use a stack is to get several MIDI instruments to fire from a single MIDI note. Like if you want to stack several virtual instruments together and play them all at the same time or record them all at once, you can do that. Just create the tracks you want, group them together in a summing stack, and then click record on that main folder. Then you can record and edit your MIDI just on one track, and it will play that MIDI back on all the instruments inside that group. The third way that I use track stacks is for bus processing. Now I mentioned it a minute ago, if you add all the tracks to a summing stack, you can process them all together. And I do this all the time for drums, for bus compression, and bus EQ. I also do this all the time for electric guitars when I'm recording stereo guitars and it's the same part recorded twice and I want it to be in stereo. I can just add those to a group and then add the same EQ and processing on both of those tracks at the same time. Now if you want to spice up your keys, try adding some MIDI effects. Now, MIDI effects don't act like normal effects plugins where they process an audio signal as it passes through the chain, but MIDI effects actually manipulate the incoming MIDI signal. Let's check it out. So if your MIDI track is selected and the track inspector is open, you can go to right above the instrument slot there and you can go to this little box called MIDI effects. You can click on that and it shows you all the effects that are available. Some of my favorites being the arpeggiator and the note repeater. And the chord trigger is actually really cool too. If you're not super proficient at keys, it can really help you get going with some different chords. You can also stack several effects together at the same time, so you could use the chord trigger and the arpeggiator at the same time if you wanted to. Well, let's check out some examples. We'll start with the chord trigger. We'll drop that on and just hit a single note on the keyboard. And based on that single note, it'll fire a whole chord. There's a bunch of different presets in the menu on different intervals and different harmonics, and then also like genre voicings and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, we can stack several of these different effects together. So let's drop the arpeggiator on and just hit the single note again. We already got some movement going, and just by barely moving these, we'll just go a little bit on the variation in the octave. And we already got some movement there, and there's a ton of presets in here. Let's just select one. It's like, that is insane that you can just play a single note and generate a whole movement based on that. And that could be the whole bass and the whole bed of a whole new song. Now, if you want those MIDI effects to actually print in the MIDI as you record, you can right click in the blank space there on the MIDI effects and go record MIDI to track here. And then when you record, it'll bake those MIDI effects right in the region. Then you're able to open it up and customize it and make it your own. I know for me, if I'm having a hard time getting started on an idea, sometimes I'll just drop on a MIDI effect and see what different, unique, and creative things it comes up with. And even if I don't keep those ideas, even if I play them myself, it kind of gets the creative juices flowing and at least gives me some ideas for what the song could be. Now let's talk about bouncing in place. Normally, to bounce a track in Logic means to take a multi-track session with all the effects and all the automation and to sum it down into a stereo file and export that for listening and sharing and releasing. So basically, the term bounce in Logic means to summate with effects. So to bounce in place in Logic just takes the exporting out of the equation and just summates the selected regions right in your timeline. Now you can quickly render a selection of regions into one audio file just right inside of Logic. All you have to do is right-click on the region or selection of regions that you want, go down to Bounce and Join, and click Bounce in Place. Now there's a bunch of different bounce in place options, and I'm not going to dive into those, but the default works for most cases. And you click OK, and it's going to create a new track with a bounced region with all the audio effects baked into it. Now this is super helpful for saving CPU resources or consolidating your tracks down or creating stems for collaboration. So tip number 4 is to use the quick sampler. And now I often forget how easy it is to turn a sample into a playable instrument. So what we're wanting to do is turn this single pluck into a playable instrument. So we're gonna go to the top left, click Create Track, create software instrument. I'm gonna load the quick sampler up there, and then I'm just gonna drag and drop this sample right into the plugin. And you can just go in straight away and start playing it. That's creating a whole instrument just based off of a single sound. And you can customize that sound by repitching it or using LFOs, or the filters and all that stuff is available right in the quick sampler. The quick sampler is an easy and fast way to do things that you normally wouldn't do. Maybe you're dropping a guitar in and turning it into a pad, or dropping your vocal track in there and turning it into some like synth part. It's just super easy to think outside the box. Tip number 5 is to use the stock samples and loops from Logic. Now I don't utilize the Logic loops very often because a lot of them sound kind of cheesy and cheap. And especially the instrument loops can get super weird and super wacky. But a lot of the percussion stuff like shakers, tambos, and different world percussion stuff and hip-hop toppers and hi-hats and that stuff actually don't sound that bad, and I find myself using this stuff relatively often. All you have to do is pop into the Apple Loops tab in the top right and search for what you want. I'm just gonna click and drag these 2 samples in. And it's easy as that. We already have some interesting percussion going on. So there's over 30,000 samples in here, and it's kind of overwhelming, and you can sort by instrument or by genre or by description if you're looking for something specific. I find myself cutting up the samples a lot and rearranging it and finding new grooves within those percussion samples and loops that they have already. So I would really encourage you to use the loops that are there as inspiration points and just take what you want from it and leave the rest. So there's a few of my favorite features of Logic and a few things that I forget about sometimes to use but always end up coming back to because they work so well. And these are all free things in Logic that you can start using in your workflow today. Now, if you want to know a few of my favorite third-party workflows and third-party plugins, check out this video right here. Thanks so much for watching. Give this video a thumbs up if you like it. And if you're into music production or audio production, or in the future maybe even some video production stuff, subscribe to this channel so you can stick around for more videos, and I'll see you in the next one.